get to it. And the alternative title of this I'll get to later, but a lot of this is work that Maureen Christie from Friends of Shorebirds Southeast has been doing with an amazing band of volunteers for us in areas north of Adelaide, and also work that Chris Purnell's been coordinating with regards to the Shorebird 2020 shorebird monitoring program across Australia, but with a focus on Gulf St Vincent. I guess the alternative title to this talk, I'm going to be talking a bit more of use and travel outside of Gulf St Vincent. So it's really where the international part of the International Bird Sanctuary that's just been, or in the process of being developed now, comes to. So, as I said, since about 2012, Maureen Christie and Clyde Minton, who are sort of the backbone of shorebird research in Australia, have been involved in work in Gulf St Vincent, and that's built on a lot of the detailed mapping work that BirdLife Australia have been doing for us in the Gulf as well. What that mapping has defined are the important shorebird areas, which are actually quite extensive based on the mudflat and available feeding habitat and roost sites in Gulf St Vincent. So there is a lot of important shorebird habitat in the Gulf, and that's reflected in the numbers of birds we're seeing there. What we've been focusing on is shorebird research around a real hotspot for us, and an accessible hotspot, which is Thompson's Beach, just north of Adelaide. And that's a really good place for both feeding and roosting for a range of shorebird species. So the Gulf itself has long been recognised since the 80s as a really important shorebird site. It's a terminal site, so birds from the flyway, the migration flyway, come down and they spend their summer in the Gulf. They spend it here. They don't, move further away. Some species will move around, but a lot of birds come here, over 20,000. And a key area for them historically has been the Dry Creek saltfields, which is under a lot of change. So the birds spend their summers here, and then the migratory birds spend their summers here, then they undertake this migration up to key staging areas in Southeast Asia, particularly China, and then up into the Arctic. And what they really do there, we don't know. This is one of just many flyways across the world. So the birds are flying up our East Asia, Australia flyway, with millions of other birds in different flyways up to the Arctic, where they just spread out across the vast tundra during a very short Arctic summer, do all their mating, their nesting, raising of chicks, and the chicks have to be flying out of there before the summer ends and the tundra freezes over. So it's a very short burst of activity up north, and then once that's done, they begin their trek back down to get back here to Gulf St Vincent for our summer. The birds themselves, when they're down here, are really driven by the tides. So at low tide, they're out on those mud flats feeding. When it's high tide, they fly off. Their available feeding area isn't there, so they go and rest up, because they're needing to put on weight and store energy for that migration. And Gulf St Vincent, in particular that area north of Adelaide, is a real good mix of suitable habitat, both natural mudflat and sandfire, but also historically artificial ponds like salt fields and stormwater wetlands, which are really important places for the birds to roost and rest up when the high tide is in. So some of these wetlands are important for different species as well. So the Barker Inlet wetlands, you see a lot of the nomadic shorebirds and Australian birds in there, as well as waterfowl. What the mapping that BirdLife and the range of volunteers from Birds SA have been doing for us since 2007 has really defined the key areas we need to be undertaking on-ground works, fencing and awareness about how important these are for shorebirds. But it doesn't really tell us what the birds are doing. It gives us counts and numbers of birds at different places, but it doesn't tell us how the birds are really using the whole of the Gulf. But one of the things that piqued the interest of Clive Minton was the number of different species, particularly red knot, that are using some of the sites north of Adelaide. And they are really significant numbers, and that we sort of use that to bring Clive in. And his team of sort of nomadic bird researchers now spend a couple of their weeks on migration between Tasmania, Victoria, Eyre Peninsula and Broome, doing shorebird research for us in here. And historically, there really is not a lot of banding data for South Australian shorebirds. This is basically the mark recapture knowledge of different species, or this is for one species of bar-tailed godwit. In the old days, there was a little silver band that was put on to actually work out where that bird was from. You'd have to catch the bird again and read it. Now they use coloured lead flags, and each country or region has a different coloured lead flag. And they can also be engraved with numbers, so we can identify individuals. There's a network of volunteers coordinated by Chris Hassel, who works up in Broome, and people like Adrian Boyle, who then train volunteers in China to identify lead flags. So there's a whole network of volunteers throughout the flyway. So we got the Victorian Wader Study Group and Friends of Shorebirds South East to really target flagging of birds since 2012. The way you catch these birds is using cannons that you dig in, and they're attached to a net. You basically lie the net out. These people just know how to place these nets at the right tide. You need a good 2 metre high tide to be able to do this work. Then you go and sit and wait for the tide to come in for a few hours, and then you fire the net over the birds and rush out, grab the birds, and they get processed. That work also, the measurements are really important as well, because by looking at the measurements of different birds here and across the world, we can make some assumptions of where the birds move to as well, based on similar measurements of different populations around the world. It's really, we're getting a good rate of local return on flag sightings, and that's really important for local awareness. So people are identifying and connecting with individual birds, which is really sort of winning the hearts and minds of local people in this area. We're also, by sitting on the beach for vast amounts of times waiting for the tide, getting a better idea of observations of daily movement. So that movement from high tide to the back beaches and the back lagoons. The sort of dusk movement at high tide of birds down to one particular spot on the coast at Light Beach. And we're really understanding the importance of back lagoons and salt marsh as a roosting and feeding habitat for these birds, which has generally been underlooked, I think, in our Gulf. So when these back lagoons flood, they're used for foraging. But the other really amazing thing that we don't find in other parts of, well, shorebird researchers haven't seen before, is this is Light Beach, and these are islands of floating seagrass wrack. So at high tide, the seagrass lifts itself up and forms these floating islands, which are perfectly safe roosts for the shorebirds to use, which is a really different sort of use of wrack than other parts of Australia. And so the birds actually just sit out there at high tide, which makes them incredibly difficult to catch because they're not coming into the beach necessarily. So they're there. We've had some good international returns of different species, particularly godwit, around China, where the Global Flyway Network has its observers. And that again really increases the local knowledge and understanding of this area. We still don't know where the birds go up in the tundra. And that's one of the questions we're trying to find out now. But just having the media coverage of a migration story has really changed the attitude, I think, of the people we're dealing with on the beach at Thompson's Beach in those local communities. When they see these sorts of epic migrations, it really clicks that their beach is important, not just locally, but internationally. And so we get good flyways there. We also have records, particularly for godwit, up near the North Korean border, near a reserve in China there. And again, we're starting to build those connections with people throughout the flyway with this research. The forestry researchers up there who do shorebird work are sending their photos of the habitat there. And again, it's really increasing the local community's awareness that these birds really need their beaches to make these epic migrations. There's another godwit AKL that hangs out near the North Korean border. Some of these godwits now, we're getting constant returns back in China and here over the last 4 years. We were trying to put radio transmitters or satellite trackers on Godwit. As soon as we bought the Godwit, we couldn't catch any. So we changed to another large bird called grey plover, about which virtually nothing is known of its migration. But what we also want to know is what the plovers are doing in summer when they're in Gulf St Vincent. And we found extremely good sight fidelity of these. But these birds don't move very far for the whole summer that they're in the Gulf. We thought they'd be moving up and down. We certainly suspect other species do. But these ones just sat on the beach at Thompson's Beach the whole summer, feeding up. We attach a small satellite with an elastic harness, which is designed to drop off. Sometimes it drops off a bit too early. But the first, again, just showing that real sight fidelity over summer. And what that picked up was how much these birds use that back salt marsh as well. And that's a bird out on the weed mats with the aerial sticking out there. It also gives an idea what prompts migration. So in each migration event, we've had a high pressure system basically come up over Adelaide. That's created some nice light southeasterly winds that the birds follow over the central desert. This first bird we had on migration, basically we lost transmission up north, and it had hit a very early April low pressure system up in the tropics. It basically, really pushed it back out to sea, probably is what we expect, and it ran into something like this, a severe thunderstorm out in the middle of off of Indonesia. We've had more success this year with two birds. One that both birds left in March, basically leaving Thompson's Beach, and then after getting that same low pressure system, flying up over the Philippines. One bird stopped in Taiwan, and then it sort of made its way back up to China, the mainland China, and still up there with another bird hanging around the estuaries up there. So, a 7,000 kilometre long haul, flight over 6 days, sort of averaging about 60 kilometres an hour. And that's just the first leg of the migration. We're expecting to get to the tundra now. So that's the two plots of the birds we've got active now. That's where they are in China at the moment. But it's this sort of data that we've been collecting since 2007 that really has given that community, acceptance of the establishment of the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary. So it's the science in itself is answering questions about migration and the life cycle of these birds, but it's also winning the hearts and minds and understanding of the local community up there. So the Bird Sanctuary, which is being management plans under design now, will initially cover off amazing amount of high-value salt marsh area for conservation, and we're hoping to continue this work into the future. We also work on the hearts and minds by other ways, involving the arts community. We've got a wonderful shorebird lantern in the Ausasia Festival and those sorts of things. So anyway, that's it.
Time for one question for Tony.
Thank you. Nice and loud, Patricia. Louder.
Thanks for the beautiful pictures. Such a beautiful part of the world. I'm just wondering, what are the key threats for these birds when in our shores? You mentioned the seagrass, pitchcast rat, and we know there's an industry developing to remove that from the beaches, climate change.
Yeah.
And how many of those threats will the sanctuary actually address and manage?
Well, we're already been addressing threats through the On-Ground Works program that's funded by the Natural Resource Management Board since about 2006. But the other part of that work that Chris Purnell and others is doing in mapping habitat also relates to a threat risk when they're doing the count. So we've got, what's really changed significantly over time is the habitat disturbance and then just the disturbance risk, particularly with the change in operations of the salt field. But the key threat locally is disturbance. Because if the birds, the migratory species are continually disturbed, they're not feeding. or they're flying away and they're using energy. And it's maintained, the recaptures where we've had, say, grey plover caught in November and then we catch them in February, they put on 45% of their body weight getting ready for migration. So it's really about making sure that we make people aware not to disturb, but through the federal funding and the levy, the NRM funding, we have had a very intensive fencing program to protect salt marsh and key roosting sites as well. And it's really about that. Off-road motorbike disturbance is a key issue, both that we need to address. Yep.
All right, thanks very much, Tony.